All right, I want to welcome everyone to ATSSA's virtual town hall, the election update and 2021 impact on roadway safety. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. This session is being recorded. We will provide details for how to access this recording through the ATSSA website at the conclusion of this webinar. Also, after our speaking notes, we will have a Q&A session with our speaker. So please, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A section. You can find that in the Zoom navigation bar in Zoom, and feel free to submit them at any point. And at the end of the speaking portion, I will ask those questions to our speaker. Most of you do know our speaker. For those of you who don't, today we will have Nate Smith, who is the Vice President of Government Relations here at ATSSA, talk about what's going on the last couple of weeks and where we're looking towards in 2021. So Nate, if you'd like to take it away, it's all you.
Great, thanks Cameron, I appreciate it. Let me just bring up my slides. Great. Well, believe it or not, nice to see everybody, first and foremost. Of course, I feel like I start a lot of my virtual presentations with, I wish we were able to do so in person, certainly more frequently than we have been able to. So I'm looking forward to getting back to that, whether it's at your chapter meeting or a future ATSSA event. So stay the course and we'll get back together real soon. But believe it or not, it's been 2 weeks since Election Day. On one hand, it feels like it was a lifetime ago. On the other hand, it's still ongoing. You know, there's a handful of races that are have not yet been called, and we'll talk through those a little bit. But the process is moving on, and we want to spend a little bit of time today talking about what the outcomes of the 2020 elections were, both from a federal perspective and a state ballot initiative perspective. There were a handful of state transportation ballot questions on your at the polling place this year, far fewer than there normally were. We'll talk about that in a moment too. We're also going to look at what the forecast is for the next 6 or so weeks that are left in the calendar year in 2020, of what we can expect Congress to try and get done between now and New Year's. And then finally, we'll talk about what the forecast is for 2021 as it relates to infrastructure and specifically roadway safety. We will focus in on this broad conversation that's been going on for a long time on an infrastructure package and the fact that we are currently living under an extension of the current highway bill. And so we'll delve into that a bit too. So let's get started. At the end of the day, in 2020, from a congressional perspective, the takeaway here is it was a pretty good day for Republicans in Congress. The expectation going into election day was that, and many of you heard me talk about this too, was that their expectation was that Democrats would pick up some seats. I believed it would be on the lower side, 5 to 7 seats or so, that they would retain the majority and pick up, you know, a half a dozen seats. In fact, they will be retaining the majority, but with having lost seats. At this point, it's getting close to a dozen. It's not quite there yet, of seats lost in the House to the Republican Party. Not enough to swing the majority to Republicans, but certainly it'll be a much closer, more snug majority for the Democratic Party. And so that will have implications on trying to get policies done and legislation through the House over the next couple of years. There are 9 races that have not yet been called, almost half of which are in New York State. For some reason, it's been very slow in counting the votes in New York, with around 85% of the votes being tallied. We have pretty good guesses of who will be winning those races. But as of right now, they just have not yet been called, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So it's very likely that Nancy Pelosi will be Speaker again next year. She's indicated that her desire to serve another 2-year term as Speaker. And with Democrats retaining the majority, there's no indication that there will be a change in the Democratic leadership in any of the top places of the Democratic leadership. at some point going down into the future, thinking ahead, whether it is in 22 or in 24 or whenever it might be, there will be a significant shakeup in the Democratic leadership, whether they're in the majority or in the minority. The top three leaders of the party in the House, Nancy Pelosi, Steny Hoyer, and Congressman Clyburn from South Carolina, are all in their 80s, and so, or late 70s or 80s. So it's time will be showing that there will be a shakeup in Democratic leadership at some point. It's just very, very unlikely. Nearly, you can almost go to the bank on it that it won't be happening for next year. So in terms of ATSSA supporters who won't be coming back to Congress next year, there are a couple. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see someone named Dan Lipinski. He's a congressman from Chicago. He's been in Congress for about 15 years, and he was ATSSA's, or is ATSSA's, top supporter in Congress. He's been a stalwart safety champion for many, many years. He actually lost his primary election back in the spring, back in March. And so we've known since March that he would not be coming back to Congress next year. But we'll certainly be sad to see him go. He's a senior member of the House Transportation Committee, and like I said, has been a roadway safety champion for, gosh, at least a decade, if not longer. On the far left, you see freshman Xochitl Torres Small from New Mexico. Did not sit in the Transportation Committee, but certainly was a transportation supporter and ATSSA leader. She toured some of our members in the Albuquerque area over the years, so we'll be sorry to see her go as well. In the middle is Anthony Brindisi, for those of you who participated in the ATSSA virtual fly-in back in September. He spoke during that briefing portion on September 15th. His is one of the races that is not yet called. That's hence the arrow, and you'll see a theme of that in the next slide too. It's likely he will not be coming back to Congress next year. He's down quite a bit with votes yet to be counted, but the race has not yet been called. But we expect that he will likely be, in the end, losing his race. So this is a snapshot of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee of the members who are either retiring, we already know that have lost, or if there's an arrow above them, their race has not yet been called. And so the takeaway from this slide is that there's going to be a pretty significant shakeup to the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee next year. There are benefits to that. The benefits are there's going to be new members coming in who are looking to be educated, who are looking to develop relationships, who are looking for issues to start championing and really get behind and get active on. And roadway safety is a great opportunity for new members to latch onto. It's a win-win issue, especially the roadway safety infrastructure piece that you all do. It's a win-win because it not only saves lives, investments in roadway safety infrastructure, we all know, saves lives every single day. But because it's construction related and infrastructure related, it also is a job creator piece of legislation as well. You all, with increased infusion of federal dollars into the roadway safety infrastructure investment funds, you all are able to purchase more equipment, you're able to hire more employees, you're able to spend more in the local economy. So it really does spur economic growth, investments in infrastructure, and specifically roadway safety infrastructure. So we're really going to be calling on you all to help us develop some of these relationships with these new members. We don't yet know who those new members are, and we likely won't know who they are until next year, January, potentially even into February, depending on how slow the process is from a virtual perspective of naming committee members. But once we do know who will be coming into the committee, we will be looking and trying to identify ATSSA members in those congressional districts to start developing relationships right out of the gate. If you can be in early and make an impact before sort of the hordes of everybody else gets to members of Congress, you really do have a leg up, and you're a quarter of the way there of winning your argument. So looking at this slide, the top three individuals on the top row from left to middle all either lost their primary or opted to retire this year. So we know they're gone. On the bottom four from left to right either lost their primary or lost their election just 2 weeks ago. So we know they're gone. And those 4 down there are Democrats. The top 3 on the left are Republicans. The 3 individuals with arrows above their head, the races have not yet been called. For 2 of them, I would actually go out on a limb and say we think we probably know who the victor will be. That's Anthony Delgado in the top right and Sean Patrick Maloney in the bottom right, both from New York State. The one with the red tie is Congressman Garcia from California. I think he's ahead right now by about 100 or 150 votes, maybe a couple hundred votes. It's very, very close. And so it'll be some time before we know who wins that race. So all this to say is that there could be upwards to 10 openings on the committee next year. The other thing to keep in mind is that because Democrats are losing the depth of their majority, sort of the strength of their majority, because it'll be a much closer Congress, the makeup of the committee will be different. There will likely be more Republicans serving on the Transportation Committee as a proportion to their minority majority makeup in the full Congress. So even if there are 5 Democrats who come off, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are 5 Democrats that are going to go on because of that change in the proportion. There may be 5 that come off and only 2 or 3 that come on, depending on that makeup. And again, that's not something we'll know yet. But once that's identified, we'll certainly be calling on ATSSA members to help us develop those relationships. So over on the Senate side, Republicans have 50 confirmed seats. Democrats have 48. Democrats and independent aligned Democrats. Think Bernie Sanders is a independent who caucuses with the Democrats, as well as the senator from Maine is an independent who caucuses with the Democrats. So there's 48 of them. We won't know who will have the majority in the Senate until January. As many of you probably are aware, that both Senate races in Georgia have gone to a runoff that will happen in January. And so the world will be poor. If you live in Georgia, I'm very sorry, because the next couple of months are going to be, if you thought, the last 6 months were unbearable in terms of TV ads and radio ads and campaigning, the world is going to be focused on Georgia over the next 2 months, month and a half, 2 months. And so, buckle up, because it's going to be bumpy, I think, or it's going to be a rough ride for the state of Georgia over the next few weeks. So the 2 races will be decided in January, and that will decide the majority. If Democrats win both, then the majority will be Democratic because of 50-50 tie. The vice president will cast that tie-breaking vote. If all Republicans have to do is win one of those 2, and they retain their majority in the Senate. Special elections or runoff elections, just by and large, are extraordinarily difficult to guess, to poll, to estimate. You mix into that equation the fact that this year polling was way off all around the country on congressional races, just wildly off. It's difficult to even try and find either a silver lining or figure out why. I mean, it was just off. So you mix that into these 2 Georgia races, and it's going to be very difficult. Essentially, we're not going to know until we know. We're not going to know until the votes are cast and counted, and the new senators are sent to DC. So it'll be really interesting. Regardless, it's going to be extraordinarily close Senate, whether it's tied or whether it's 51-49 or 52-48. It's going to be a very close Senate. So it's going to be there's going to be a lot of compromise need to be made in order to get anything through the Senate. But infrastructure plays well under that scenario, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. This slide just shows you, kind of my takeaway. The comment I made at the top of this presentation was that Republicans had a pretty good night on election night in Congress, and this kind of goes to that comment. On the left were all the endangered Republican senators who were up for re-election this year, sort of tranched in categories. So the most in danger at the top, sort of the second tier and the third tier. On the right, you saw really the only two Democrats who were considered to be endangered. Strike-throughs means they lost, and so you saw two ended up losing on the Republican side, one ended up losing on the Democratic side, and then the highlighted are the two open seats, or excuse me, the two runoff seats that we'll see what happens in Georgia. But Democrats had all the opportunity in the world to take the majority. If you look at that list of Senate races on the left, and really we're only able to pick off two people. And so this is just sort of a snapshot as to the outcome being pretty different than what forecasts were expecting leading into Election Day. On a state perspective, there were far fewer transportation-related ballot initiatives, and frankly, ballot initiatives in general, not just transportation-related, but across the board, than there normally would be. And if you've got questions on this, I urge you to reach out to our Director of State Government Relations, Renee Gibson, and maybe if Renee can share, or Cameron can share Renee's email address in the chat box. Renee's email is just renee.gibson@atsa.com, and she'd be happy to walk through some of these items. But one of the big reasons that we saw a fall off in just ballot questions across the board around the country is because of COVID. When you, generally speaking, when you try and get a question put on the ballot for Election Day, you have to go around and you have to get signatures, and you have to engage people, you have to run a campaign essentially. And with stay-at-home orders and non-convening orders and non-gathering orders, that was a very difficult situation. And many states sort of just said, hey, we're going to sort of skip this cycle, and we'll hit it again in a couple of years. There were a couple of transportation-focused ballot questions that were on the docket. One was in Arkansas, which was successful. That permanently continues the 0.5% sales tax for state and local transportation, specifically roads, bridges, highway projects throughout the state. The second item was actually passed earlier during the primary this summer, but was in Maine, which was a bond item for $105 million for transportation infrastructure projects for the state of Maine. And I pulled these two out because one of the challenges that we're seeing right now around the country, and we've talked a little bit about this over the last few months, is that states are really struggling to, or beginning to struggle, to come up with funding for their transportation projects due to, primarily due to reduced receipts into their state transportation funds. And so you all know how this works, that the states spend the money and then submit receipts to the federal government, and the federal government for federal aid highway projects kicks in their 80%, which is the federal share of a federal aid highway project. And so if the state doesn't have the money to spend on the transportation projects, they started getting shelved. And even if the federal money is there, the state doesn't have the cash to get those projects going, even knowing that there'll be some receipts coming back from reimbursements coming back from the federal government. And so, Arkansas and Maine are attempting to get ahead of that, as other states are as well. Because the other challenge is, it's very likely that the next highway bill, hopefully next year, and we'll talk a bit about that in just a moment, will have increased funding for transportation projects. If you look at the Republican Senate bill that was worked on last year, that had increases. If you looked at the House Democratic bill that was passed out of the House this summer, that had significant increases. So if you think about an 80-20 split between the federal government and the state government, and say you had $100 and the feds were going to pick up 80 and the locals had to the state had to pick up 20, if all of a sudden that number is $300, that's significantly more. Now the state has to pick up $60 on that 300. And so states need to be thinking about, how do we prepare for likely increases coming from the federal government so that we don't lose out on their money, so we can ensure that we can meet our matches. And so that's something that a lot of our chapters are beginning to think about. And again, I would urge you to reach out to our Director of State Government Relations if you have any questions, or your chapter or your company want to get involved on an advocacy effort in your state focused on roadway safety, focused on transportation funding, whatever it might be. Now, looking ahead to a Biden administration for next year, we're beginning to hear about possibilities for the Secretary of the Department of Transportation. Over the last 20 years, we have seen some indication of putting opposite party cabinet positions into DOT. If you think back to George W. Bush in his first term, he had a Democratic DOT secretary in Norm Mineta. And then if you think about President Obama's first term, he had Republican Congressman Ray LaHood as DOT secretary for his first 4 years. And so there's been some recent indications that there's some level of comfort of putting somebody of the opposite party at DOT. Joe Biden has also indicated that some desire of having Republicans serve in his cabinet. And so DOT is a natural fit for that. So that's sort of caveat number one. But these are the individuals who are being chattered about right now to be heading towards US DOT. On the left-hand side is John Porcari. He served as Deputy Secretary of DOT under Obama, so that would be sort of a natural promotion for him. He's a former Maryland Highway Administration administrator as well. The gentleman with the bow tie is a congressman from Oregon, Earl Blumenauer, and he's a huge bicycle advocate. If you squint, you can see on his lapel, he actually has a bike pin, which he literally wears every single day. I don't think I've ever seen him without it. And so he is just sort of an evangelist for bicycles. He is a very big safety advocate. He's big on bike and ped safety. He has authored and introduced Vision Zero Towards Zero Deaths legislation in Congress, and is also laser focused on fixing the Highway Trust Fund. He sits on the committee that would address raising user fees to address the shortfall in the Highway Trust Fund. So he is intimately knowledgeable about not just the transportation policy, but the transportation funding side of transportation as well. In the middle, many of you probably recognize Rahm Emanuel, former congressman from Chicago, former mayor of Chicago, former White House chief of staff under Obama. He's talked about, to be fair, I think I would be surprised if it shook out that he was going to become DOT secretary. It seems to me that after you serve as White House chief of staff, that seems like not a step up, a step to the side maybe, or even a step back perhaps. He also would potentially have trouble getting confirmed in Congress. The two individuals on the right, on the top row, John Kasich and Charlie Dent, are both Republicans, so they would be your potential Republican options. Kasich being the former Ohio governor, and Dent being a former congressman from Pennsylvania, who again was very vocal and active on transportation policies in Congress while he served. The leading contender, though, right now is at the bottom. You'll see Juan Arvizu on the left, who is ATSSA's former national board chairman. But this was taken at a presidential candidate forum that we were at in Las Vegas in February, right before COVID hit. And he's there with LA Mayor Eric Garcetti. Garcetti is really seen as the front runner right now for the DOT secretary spot. He runs LA, so as a mayor, has worked on transportation projects and was a national co-chair of the Biden campaign, so has been advising the Biden campaign for a while now. So it seems as though if Garcetti is interested in coming to DC to serve in the cabinet, this would be, at this point, the most likely position that he could see himself falling into. So looking at what does the rest of this year look like? Where are we at today, and what can we expect over the next, I guess it would be about 6 weeks or so until New Year's. For one is Congress just released and unveiled their fiscal year 21 appropriations bill for transportation with increased funding or essentially FAST Act level funding, but it's really going to be coupled together with the December 11th deadline to do something for funding the government. And so we either have to see full-on fiscal year 21 appropriations roll through to fund everything through September 30 of next year. There needs to be a short-term, so that's option A. Option B would be another short-term continuing resolution to get into next year. Or option C, theoretically, is a government shutdown. We're all hopeful that doesn't happen, and certainly are pushing Congress to not allow that to happen. As you know, shutdowns are disastrous for our industry. So it's that is sort of the next big hurdle that we see ourselves in. So that's about 3 weeks away or so. And it'll most of the focus right now on congressional action, if anything is going to get done, is going to be appropriations related, trying to get over that December 11th hump. The other piece of legislation that could potentially roll through and be signed into law between now and the end of the year is COVID relief related. To be frank, I'm not super optimistic that we'll see a COVID relief package done between a lame duck Congress and President Trump. You think so? So Congress, even though after it's been since Election Day, still can come back and work on legislation until their term is over in the beginning of January. So COVID relief could be something that they come back together on. If there was going to be an opportunity to try and get something done, it seems to me that it likely would have been before Election Day, right, when you could then have turned around and campaigned on that as a campaign item rather than after Election Day. So I think it's more likely you'll see that kicked until 21, and we'll talk about that in a second. We also will be looking and trying to figure out who will be leading the Congress next year. So their leadership races will be happening internally in Congress, both the Democratic side and on the Republican side over the next few weeks. The two items at the bottom are interesting. So for those of you who attended the ATSSA Government Relations Committee meeting at the virtual mid-year in August, you heard from Federal Highway Administrator Nicole Nason, and the question was posed about the MUTCD, the rule for MUTCD, the notice for MUTCD, and the final rule for the minimum levels of retroreflectivity for pavement marking, which have been sort of languishing out there for a long time. And she commented that it was her strong desire to get both of those done before Election Day. So here we are 2 weeks after Election Day, and they have not yet been made public. And so we've been in conversations with Federal Highways over the last week or so, and it sounds like that they are still actively trying to get something done. They didn't indicate that it was imminently coming, but I also frankly don't know that they would have been able to tell me, hey, it's coming next week, without violating some rules. And so, we're still monitoring this. We'll keep in contact with Federal Highways, and as soon as we get a sense that this might be happening, we'll be certain to let you all know that that's coming down the pike. But know that it's being worked on still. There's also there's precedence for administrations who are leaving office to try and get through as many changes to rulemaking as absolutely possible. When Obama was leaving office in 2015, at USDOT, there were a lot of rules that were pushed through at the 11th hour to try and get done before their term ended. And so it's not unheard of for some of these to try and be finalized before the last few hours of an administration. So keep an eye open for that. We'll be letting you know when we hear something as to what that looks like. And then finally on the forecast is a Federal Communication Commission. And so for those of you following the spectrum issue, so the transportation safety spectrum issue, 5.9 gigahertz, the FCC has really been indicating over many months now that they're looking to reallocate some of that spectrum for unlicensed Wi-Fi and away from transportation specific issues. This is an example of within one administration, two different agencies being on polar opposite sides of a policy issue. Over at USDOT, Secretary Elaine Chao and her team are firmly in the camp that this bands of spectrum should be reserved exclusively for transportation safety. So our industry, whether you're working on vehicle to infrastructure communications and traffic signals or pavement markings, temporary traffic control, traffic signs, On the other end of the spectrum is the FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, who has indicated for many, many months, if not years, that his desire to open it up to sort of the telecom industry and allow you, in an ideal world, to be going down I-95 streaming Netflix as your car is sort of autonomously driving. And so this is an area that we've been engaged on individually, as well as with our partners at the Auto Innovators and the American Highway Users Alliance and others. And so we continue to advocate for the spectrum to be reserved exclusively for transportation safety, and that's an issue that we'll continue to be really pounding the pavement on. When we expect this rule to be made tomorrow at the FCC meeting, and so there'll be a blog post from the ATSSA blog with our statements and comments as that decision rolls forward. Looking at 2021, infrastructure, as you all know, infrastructure has been talked about as a sort of quote top priority of campaigns going back to the Clinton-Trump campaign of 2016. Both Clinton's team and Trump's team were talking about wanting to do a big, broad infrastructure package. Fast forward 4 years, and infrastructure was talked about during the 2020 campaign by many of the Democratic presidential candidates, as well as the Trump reelection team. And so infrastructure is consistently talked about as a top priority, but has not yet really come to fruition. We also expect that the first thing that'll be on the docket for next year is a COVID relief package, and we'll continue to push for an inclusion of state DOT relief. Goes back to my comment earlier about our concern with state DOTs having or not having the money necessary to meet their matches and continue projects going forward due to reduced revenue. And so we're continuously pushing for inclusion of state DOT relief, financial relief in the next COVID relief package, which, as I said, I'm just not very optimistic that that'll happen in 2020, much more optimistic that you would see something done very early in 2021. I think Congress would then pivot to something like an infrastructure package, but don't be surprised if it comes in smaller bites. I'm not sure there's an incredible appetite, especially in the Senate, to do a $1.5 or $2 trillion infrastructure package that's all packaged together in one large bill. I think what you would be more likely to see is a highway bill reauthorization funded at say $400 or $500 billion, as well as perhaps a water reauthorization and a broadband investments. And so I think you might see these smaller one-off bills rather than a broad cobbled together infrastructure package. So don't be surprised if it comes in that smaller packaging. You will see pretty quick action from the T&I committee on a highway bill reauthorization. Remember that because that bill didn't pass into law, it just passed out of the House, it has to be reintroduced next year. So all legislation dies with this Congress. So the committee will have to reintroduce their bill. It'll likely look very similar to what was passed out of the House this past go around, perhaps with some tweaks here and there. But we expect that to happen sooner rather than later. Over on the Senate side, it might be a slightly different story. We expect a chairmanship change in the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. The expectation is that John Barrasso will be leaving as chairman of the committee, and if Republicans retain the majority, then the senator from West Virginia, Shelley Moore Capito, would become chair, and it would be likely that she would bring her own staff. So if for no other reason, the change in staff and getting them up to speed, that'll take some time, and she will likely want to have her own stamp on that bill that was passed out of committee a year and a half ago. So don't be surprised if the EPW committee takes a little bit more time to get a bill drafted and passed out of committee than the Transportation Committee in the House. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to money. Whether it's a $300 or $400 billion highway bill, whether it's a $2 trillion infrastructure bill, how is it being paid for? There's an indication that Democrats will try and change up the tax code again. With the Republican Senate, that's going to go nowhere. And so the sticking point will continue to be, where is the money going to come from to pay for these relatively large dollar amount packages? And then certainly from a DOT perspective, there's going to be nominations, confirmations, and appointments that need to be made that may slow down that process as well. So with that, I think Cameron, I'll turn it over to see if there's any questions that have been coming in to either the chat box or the Q&A as we've been going forward.
Great. Yeah, Nate, there are a few questions. This is from Jay Bremer. You kind of touched on a part of it, but I am interested on your take on the second half of this question. The question is, the Transportation Transition Panel is top heavy with transit and light rail experts. Do you expect to see the next Secretary of the DOT coming from this group? And what is the impact on transportation's dollars going towards these initiatives?
So the first part of the question is, the Biden team has released their list of transportation transition advisors. And Jay is absolutely right. That is very focused both on labor union side as well as state agency and local agency, transit agency, regional MPO agency officials. And so I think that I would be surprised if the DOT secretary came from that group. I will not be surprised if you saw deputy secretaries, assistant secretaries, undersecretaries, administrators potentially coming from a group like that, whether it's the Federal Transit Administrator, Federal Highways, or the Undersecretary for Policy. Those types of positions could very well be coming from a list like that. The second half of that question is, what's the impact of transportation dollars going towards those initiatives if those transit-focused individuals go to the DOT? The good thing about the Highway Trust Fund is Congress sets those priorities. And so within the Highway Trust Fund, there are two accounts. There's the mass transit account, and there is the highways account. It's split 80-20. It's had that split since the 80s when there was a deal struck by President Reagan and the Democratic Congress at that time. So our focus will be on Congress and trying to ensure that as many of the dollars as possible are going to the highways sub-account within the Highway Trust Fund to ensure that there is a real focus on investing in roads, bridges, highways, and specifically roadway safety.
Great. Another question I have is from Henry Ross. Henry asks, putting the Senate runoffs in Georgia aside, what is the likelihood that the filibuster rule will be changed by either majority?
There's a real interest especially by the minority party, in this case the Democrats, to change the filibuster rule. Senator Joe Manchin is a conservative Democrat from West Virginia. By any measure, by every measure, he is the most conservative Democrat, not just in the Senate, I would say likely in Congress. And he has indicated that he is not in favor of changing the filibuster rule. So with that announcement, and that was a month maybe ago or so, I think that there's going to be an attempt to do so. I'm not quite sure that it'll finally be killed this time around.
Another question from Jay Bremer. Biden ran on strengthening union programs. Do you see a push for a requirement of union participation with federal funding similar to Tiger Grant programs during the Obama administration?
I think you're going to see a strengthening in the relationship with unions across the board. I think under a Biden administration, I think that, I mean, if you look at the transition team, it was very, there was, I don't know, maybe a half a dozen different unions represented. There's already discussions about how to really strengthen that ties between the incoming administration and unions, whether they're construction unions or not. And so I would not be surprised if you saw different ways of trying to tie in union participation to federal programming. The interesting thing, though, I was just reading this actually I guess it was yesterday, there was an article talking about unions being split on potential labor secretary nominees. And one union in particular, or one sector of unions, construction industry unions, being very much in the favor of one particular nominee or candidate for labor. And there was a stat that said, and I'll confirm it after, I think it was in Politico, that said within the construction industry, upwards to 75% of the actual union members within the construction industry were planning on voting for Donald Trump. And so there was this discussion about if Biden decides to reach out to sort of construction union industry people to try and appeal to Trump voting union members or not. And I just thought that was an interesting, from a political science perspective, kind of an interesting debate that's emerging within the union world.
Great. Don't have any more questions. We do have one more question, and then I'll ask one to give people a couple more minutes to get their last thoughts in. From Tom McSwain, your thoughts on the Senate Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Appropriation Subcommittee's FY21 spending bill that was released last week, I believe.
Yeah, so the challenge here really is going to be, it's in part COVID related. You know, if there's going to be a focus on trying to do something COVID relief related this Congress, so over the next 6 weeks, that's when we start to really try and figure out if this full FY21 is going to go forward. We were on a conference call, gosh, I guess it was the day it was released, just about a week ago, with the Senate THUD committee staff, so the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development subcommittee staff. And that was their takeaway, was we are explicitly tied to the work of a potential COVID relief. And because they don't know if there's going to be a COVID relief package, because appropriations would then have to pay for that COVID relief package, and that would have an impact on fiscal year 21, because we are in fiscal year 21 at the federal level. Because they are not certain whether or not there's going to be a COVID package, the committee decided, because there's a very good working relationship between Republicans and Democrats on the subcommittee, both in the House and in the Senate, on transportation. They decided to push out their priorities, knowing that that could potentially be mucked up if there is a COVID relief package done in the next 6 weeks. So I think we'll know much more in the coming weeks as to the likelihood of this getting done pre-December 11, or if it's going to be punted into next year. And so stay tuned, because that's something that we're still working on pretty strongly and trying to figure out if this is truly going to be going forward, or if this is going to get a punt into calendar year 21.
All right, and again, if anyone has any questions, it's probably the last couple of minutes to get them in. I'll ask you a question, Nate. You were at ATSSA during the Obama-Biden administration, and now we have another Biden administration, so you do have some familiarity there. What do you think will be the biggest difference transportation-wise working with the Trump-Pence administration and now the Biden-Harris administration?
One of the big changes was, and this is not Trump-Obama related or Trump-Biden related, it's more Republican versus Democrat related. I would say that typically, under Republican administrations, there's more of an interest in full engagement with industry, just sort of broadly speaking. And so we will be having to work to ensure that industry is represented. You know, an example might be if in the next highway bill next year, many of you have heard me talk about a working group on connected and automated vehicles that the House bill would have called for had it been made into law. We have to work to make sure that our industry is represented at the table in those types of working groups, and it's not just the automakers, that it's not just sort of advocacy groups from a pedestrian perspective or a bicycle or motorcycle perspective, but that the construction trade industry is represented as well. So that's one takeaway. The other thing, frankly, that I'm concerned about, thinking back to 2009, is back in 2009, one of the first things that the Obama administration did, and you all remember this, was the stimulus program, was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARA. And that pumped, it was sold as an infrastructure stimulus. In reality, infrastructure only made up, what, 8%, something like that, of the final cost of the bill. That played a part in delaying the highway bill reauthorization because they were not linked. They were separate bills. So that played a part in delaying the highway bill reauthorization upwards to 3 years. And so one concern we have, and we've made this known to Congress, is that if an infrastructure package sort of broadly to stimulate economic growth is being worked on, we cannot lose sight of the fact that we have already expired the transportation program, FAST Act, and we're living under an extension. So what we do not want to repeat that situation where we have a stimulus program, but an expired transportation program that is just on a short-term extension, sort of gerbil ball or whatever you might, a wheel. So ensuring that there's still a focus on getting a reauthorization done, a 5-year reauthorization done, as well as any sort of extraneous infrastructure investments.
We did get two more questions during that answer. Jay again asked, what is the probability that the highway bill gets attention before the 11th hour?
If Jay means the 11th hour being this Congress, before New Year's Eve, I'm thinking that probability is 0, but maybe, if you want to say they're saying there's a chance, maybe there's 1% chance, but I don't see, there's no indication that I'm hearing. I mean, Transportation Committee staff is working on some stuff, but because, if for no other reason, because of the changeover in Senate EPW, likely changeover in Senate EPW committee chairmanship, and that individual is going to want to have their stamp on a bill, and changeover administration. I don't see that happening in the next 6 weeks.
Peter Spear has a question about the Trump tariffs on aluminum and steel that we saw during the last couple of years. What do you believe lies ahead for those tariffs in the new administration?
It's an area actually that I want to do a little bit more investigating on in terms of trade and tariffs. It's going to be take up a lot of time in the first year and a half, maybe 2 years of the next administration, because there are a couple of trade agreements that need to be finalized. I do think you'll see a loosening of those tariffs, but for Pete, let me do a little bit more digging, and I'll reach back out to him.
And the last question I have here is from Kyle. He has a question about if there's any indication that the new infrastructure bill would contain programs focused on funding around safety, such as intersection safety, safe routes to school, high-risk rural roads, railroad crossings, etc.
Yes to all of that, but in a little bit more detail. You're going to see an increased focus, I believe, on pedestrian safety, bicycle safety, safe routes to school specifically. We know that the House-passed highway bill really sort of zones in on safe routes to school. It brings it back out as a focus area. It used to be a focus area back in the mid to early 2000s. It was consolidated. It will likely be brought back to sort of the sunlight again. You're going to continue to see a focus on highway rail grade crossing. It's a eligible activity under the Highway Safety Improvement Program. It also has its own set aside, but it's still a real big focus area. An emerging area you'll see potentially, because it was in the Senate bill, but again, if that changes, you might see some changes there. But there was a focus on tribal road safety, of driving more federal dollars to tribal roads that need really some significant enhancements when it comes to infrastructure and roadway safety. And secondly, wildlife crash mitigation technique, countermeasures. And so there may be some opportunities for ATSSA members there if you're doing anything with wildlife mitigation, whether it's radar or whatever other sensors that might be out there.
Great. Well, that's it for questions. I am going to put up the instructions real quick on how to access the recording of this if you'd like to watch it again, as I'm sure. Great. So if you are interested, there's Nate. Here is how you can access the recording. Just go to ATSSA's website and log in with your credentials, and you'll be able to, hopefully in the next day or so, be able to rewatch the webinar. So with that, if no one else has any other questions, again, thank you for joining. And if you have any questions about any of the things we talked about, I'm sure you can always email Nate or myself or Renee on our GR team. We'll be happy to answer any questions for you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Take care.